Crystal here at the Nacogdoches Public Library, and for today's Crafternoon, we're going to be making woven wall hangings. I've got the video slowed down a little bit here so that I can explain how I set up the loom before we get started with the project. We're just using cardboard to make a loom, so this is something that beginners should be comfortable doing, and it's a very simple process. I took about a foot length of cardboard, and then along the short edges, as you can see on the side there, I have measured 1/4 of an inch all the way down the end of the cardboard. And then I've just cut it with scissors for another 1/4 of an inch or so into the ends of the cardboard. And do that on both sides. And then I've taken about an inch wide strip of additional cardboard and placed it right underneath those cuts. That is going to keep your warp thread, which is what you're going to be weaving through, a little bit lifted up off of the cardboard base of the loom so that you can maneuver more easily. And then I'm taking warp thread, and you can buy warp thread that's it's thicker than sewing thread, but it doesn't have a lot of strands, so that it's good for working with weaving, since you're going to be going in and out of it. And then I just knot the end and slide it into the first notch that I have cut there. And then I'm going to loop it on the notch on the other side, the opposite side of the loom. And then I'll loop around it and come back to the side that I began on. And then you just continue from one end to the other, looping around the notch. And I'm pulling it pretty tightly, but not, since I am just using cardboard, not really wrenching it, and I'm trying to not bend the cardboard notches as much as possible. And then you'll just continue down the length of the loom all the way across. The first loom that I made, I had an uneven number of notches, and the second one I had an even number. And in my opinion, you can do it either way. You don't have to worry too much about how many you're going to do. Then you just continue until you have strung your warp thread all the way across your loom. And this is what the finished product looks like. On the back, you can see that I've reinforced it, adding some cardboard and then duct tape, and that will help keep it from bowing as I'm adding my weft to the warp. Aside from the loom, you just need a few tools. I have a tapestry needle and a needle threader and some yarn. And what we're going to do with this project is really, especially since it's for beginners, just to really try some different techniques, some different textures and different styles and types of yarn. And we're going to make sort of a contemporary looking, almost a doodle type pattern or lack of pattern for the project. So I'm just going to thread the first color of yarn that I want to use using the needle threader. And then to get started, I'm just going to do an over-under pattern to start off the very end of my weave. And you don't want to pull very tight, because this is just cardboard. If you pull it really, really taut from the left to the right, then you're going to pull those warp threads in, and then you'll end up with sort of an uneven size width as you go down. And particularly, one of the only potential issues with using different types of yarn as you're going down your weave is that they will have different tensions, and you'll be able to pull some of them more taut than the others. And so just keep that in mind. You want to do the over-under pattern, but then also keep pushing your yarn as it goes across up against the inch strip of cardboard that you've added. You don't want to go all the way up to where your notches are. So that cardboard strip there helps keep you lined up and shows you where your weave begins. And then once you get to the end of one, then you're going to loop over and go back down the other way. And you can see as I'm going along, I am pushing the yarn up so that it is closely pressed up against the previous line. And I'm trying my best not to pull it super duper tight when it's coming from the left to the right, but keeping it pushed up tight from the top to the bottom. So after I've gone back and forth a few times, I am going to change my pattern a little bit. Instead of doing a single over under, I'm going to do double. And it's going to slightly change, obviously, the look or the texture of what the weave looks like as it goes across. And so I'm just going to do a few lines doing it the double spacing. And as I'm going through each pass, I'm still pressing the yarn up next to the previous pass. And I'm trying to pull through gently as I'm working my needle across. And if you've got a bent needle like these tapestry needles, it makes it really easy to go over and under. You can do this with a straight needle, but the bent one just makes it a little bit quicker. And you can see how on the end there, even though I'm trying not to pull it too tight because I am using this cardboard loom, it's pulling that edge in just a little bit and distorting the distance of those warp threads. But it'll be okay in the long run. It's just something that it's difficult to avoid, at least in my experience. You might be better at that than me. It's difficult to avoid it with these cardboard looms. But if this is a kind of hobby that you want to try out, but you don't want to go and spend a lot of money buying a bunch of equipment, not knowing if you're going to enjoy it, then using this kind of loom is really easy. Also, these looms, while they are practical and good for the beginner, they're not going to last for multiple projects. As you're pulling it, that's going to wear away at that cardboard, especially on those little tabs. And so it won't, last a lifetime or anything like that. You will have to make a new loom after using this a few times. So after I've done a few rows of the blue-purple yarn, and I've done a single and then a double pattern, I added another texture of yarn. And as I'm adding different types of yarn, I just leaving the tail ends hanging out the side several inches where I'm starting it. And so when we get to the finish, I'll talk about how to deal with those tail ends that are hanging out. You can also start adding yarn halfway across, or you don't have to start from the sides, particularly if you're doing sort of a freestyle version like this one. Where I don't have any sort of set pattern, I can start from any point and I'll just leave that several inches of yarn tail hanging out the back or the side when I add it in. So I've added another section of yarn, and instead of going all the way across, I've just done sort of let's do like trailing off down the side. And then I'm going to add another kind of texture and use a very loose yarn that's really just sort of a pulled wool roving. So as you can see, you kind of have to handle it a little bit differently. And so I'm being pretty delicate with it, because if I pull too hard, it will, you could pull that kind of yarn just apart directly. And then as I'm meeting up with the previous section that I've added, I'm just weaving my needle through, as you can see here. And again, I'm being pretty delicate about it so that it doesn't leave any gaps between the two different styles of yarn that I'm adding in. And I'm just going to add this a little bit. I'm going to go down and see how far I want to go. And I'm just kind of gauging this as I'm going along. Like I said, I don't really have a set plan, and I'm just seeing how it looks as I'm adding different pieces. So it's very flexible. Next, I'm adding yet a different texture, and I'm using a very thin yarn, and I'm doubling it up. So I'm using 2 strands to go across the warp. Next, I'm actually using 2 different colors of embroidery floss. So I'm adding yet a different texture, and I'm doubling it as well. So I've got 4 strands going through to get multiple different colors striking through that. And with the 4 strands, I'm not really worrying about trying to keep them all lined up and straight. I kind of like the look where they're just sort of twisted a little bit. It just gives it a little bit of a different look and texture, which is fine for me. So also keep in mind that you've got all of these tails hanging out as you're adding the different types of yarn and you're going down your loom. So you sometimes have to pull them to keep them from knotting up or getting tangled with the previous tails. And you also are going to be aware of how the different size and circumference or width of the yarn is going to affect how it's pulling on the warp threads. So I'm trying to be careful here, and with these tighter woven, smaller threads, I'm trying not to pull too tight. Another thing that you'll keep in mind is if you're using this really thick yarn or wool roving or something like that, you're going to cover a lot more ground and you're going to go more quickly. With the narrow, obviously, the smaller threads or yarn, it'll take you a lot longer to complete your weave. So all of this sort of stuff is really up to you, what you prefer aesthetically, what supplies you have, what you want your final wall hanging to look like. And so really just have fun with it, but do keep in mind that it's going to impact your final weave if you're interlacing several different types of yarn. And then here I have started, as I mentioned earlier, you can start in the middle. So I've added another texture of yarn and I started it in the middle from the back. So when you're ready to finish your weave and you've gone all the way down, you're going to have all of these loose pieces of thread and yarn hanging off of the back. And so what you're going to do is just take your tapestry needle, thread it with the ends of those threads, and then you're going to weave them back into the back of your piece. And then I'm looking at the front to make sure that I'm not accidentally coming up through the front and messing up the look on that side. And then you just continue that, weaving those threads into the back of the piece. And then if it seems, if you don't have to weave it completely, but you can weave it in a few times and then cut off the tail end. But do make sure that you're checking the front so that you're not distorting anything in the front of your design. So on this test piece, you can see what some of the different techniques and textures look like. The blue is a single over-under, the green is double. I've used some really different sort of textures. In one section, I just knotted some threads on to make sort of a shag. I've done, some pieces that are not going all the way across the loom. There's lots of different things that you could do with this. And now I'll talk a little bit about how to finish up your piece. You can simply unhook the loops from behind the notches on your loom and use a dowel to hang them from. But as you can see here, it's going to leave the top of your weave loose. So you can tie those off. You want to tie by 2 all the way down your piece. And you can cut it off of your loom and then tie those onto a dowel. Or you can leave the loops intact and then tie the knots to secure your weft and just hang with the warp pieces. And that's really just the beginning of the very basics. I hope that you have fun with this, and I hope that it inspires you to continue to learn new techniques and other ways of weaving, and I know that it has inspired me. And I hope that you've enjoyed our big read activities so far. We have more coming up, and we'll see you next time.